The slave auction was a spectacle of cruelty. The grand hall was filled with alien bidders, each one eager to claim the next prize for their own, to add another life to their collection of possessions. Lyra stood silently at the front, her head bowed, her hands shackled. She had been trained to stand this way, to endure the long hours of waiting while her worth was determined by those who held the power to buy her. Her beauty was undeniable. Her smooth, pale skin contrasted sharply against the dark robes of the alien bidders. Her hair, long and flowing, was the color of the stars, a soft, silvery hue that shimmered under the harsh lights of the auction hall. But it was not her beauty that had brought her here. It was her worth as a slave, as someone who could be molded to serve the desires of her future owner. Lyra's heart sank as the bidding began. The alien leaders were ruthless, each one trying to outbid the other, their voices rising in excitement as the price climbed higher. But despite the numbers, Lyra remained unsold. She had been passed over time and time again, her fate uncertain. Her heart began to ache as she thought of what would happen next. Would she be sent to the cruelest masters, the ones who used slaves for brutal labor? Or would she be forced into a life of servitude for someone who cared nothing for her as a person? The auctioneer's voice echoed through the hall, calling for the next bidder. Lyra stood still, barely noticing the crowd around her. She was used to being ignored, used to being nothing more than a commodity to be bought and sold. The other slaves were sold quickly, one by one, their fates sealed with the stroke of a gavel. But for Lyra, there was nothing. She stood alone, her fate hanging in the balance. As the auction came to an end, the crowd began to disperse, but Lyra remained, uncertain of what would happen next. She had heard whispers of what could be her future, another brutal assignment, another life filled with pain and humiliation. She had lived like this for as long as she could remember, trapped in a system that saw her as nothing more than a thing. But then, just as the last of the bidders left, a human man stepped forward. His name was Jackson. He was tall, with dark hair and piercing eyes that seemed to hold an unspoken strength. He had been standing in the back, unnoticed by most of the crowd, but now he was stepping into the light. His appearance was unexpected, almost out of place in the sea of alien faces, but there was something about him that caught Lyra's attention. The auctioneer turned to him with a raised eyebrow. "You wish to bid?" the auctioneer asked, his tone dripping with amusement. "Do you not know the value of this one? She is nothing more than a broken slave." Jackson's eyes never left Lyra. He didn't flinch or look away. "I will buy her," he said simply, his voice calm but firm. The crowd erupted into laughter. The idea of a human buying a slave was almost unheard of, especially a human who was clearly not wealthy enough to compete with the alien bidders. The auctioneer laughed as well, shaking his head. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. "She is a slave, a thing to be owned, not a person to be cherished." But Jackson didn't waver. He stepped forward, his hand reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small, glowing device. He pressed a few buttons, and the price was set. The auctioneer stared at the device, his eyes widening. The price that had been set was more than enough to secure Lyra's freedom. There was silence in the room as the auctioneer hesitated, unsure of what to do. The other bidders were still laughing, some even shaking their heads in disbelief. But Jackson stood calmly, his gaze locked on Lyra. The auctioneer finally gave a nod, signaling that the deal was done. Lyra's heart raced. She had been sold, but not to the people who had expected to own her. This human, this stranger, had chosen her. For a moment, she wondered if she had heard him correctly. Had he really chosen her, or had he made a mistake? Jackson stepped toward her, his voice low and steady. "Come with me," he said, extending his hand. Lyra hesitated, her instincts telling her to run, to escape. but something in Jackson's voice, something in his eyes made her pause. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't like the aliens who had stood around her, ready to bid on her like she was some kind of prize to be won. There was something different about him. Slowly, she took a step forward, then another. With each movement, her hope began to rise. Was this the beginning of a new life, a life where she wasn't just a slave? She wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she had found someone who would treat her as a person, not as a possession. She stepped into his world, leaving behind the pain of the auction hall, uncertain, but with a spark of hope in her heart. Jackson didn't speak as they made their way toward the ship. He didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than any words could. For the first time in her life, Lyra felt like she wasn't alone. The ship was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Its sleek silver exterior gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the endless stars in the sky. As they approached it, she couldn't help but feel a sense of wonder. For so long, she had been confined to the harsh, cold world of the slave market, where dreams had no place. But now, standing before a vessel that promised freedom, her heart began to race. Jackson led her up the ramp, his presence calm and steady. He didn't speak much, but there was something about him that made Lyra feel safe. It wasn't just his kindness, it was his strength, the way he carried himself like someone who had seen the darkest parts of the universe and still believed in the possibility of light. Inside the ship, the atmosphere was different, warm, inviting. The walls were lined with soft lighting, and there were small rooms that looked comfortable, unlike the cold, sterile cages she had been kept in. She looked around, unsure of where to go, but Jackson didn't leave her to wonder. He gestured to a seat near a small window. "You can sit here," he said, his voice soft. "We'll be leaving soon. I'll make sure you're comfortable." Lyra nodded, though she wasn't sure how to respond. She had never been treated with this kind of respect before. Most of the time, slaves were either ignored or ordered around without a second thought. She had learned long ago to keep her head down, to not attract attention. But Jackson had already seen her, had already chosen her. As the ship took off, Lyra pressed her face against the cool glass, watching as the planet grew smaller and smaller. A part of her felt a strange relief. She was leaving behind the place that had held her captive for so long. Yet another part of her was filled with fear. She had no idea where she was going, no idea what her future would hold. "Where are we going?" Lyra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jackson turned to her, his face unreadable. "We're heading to a safe place," he replied. "You'll be free to make your own choices there. No more auctions, no more chains." His words surprised her. For a moment, she wondered if he truly meant what he said. Could she really be free? Could someone like her, someone who had been treated as less than a person, actually have a life where she was in control? Jackson seemed to sense her doubt. He smiled gently, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I know it's hard to believe, but I promise you'll have a chance to live the life you deserve." For the first time in years, Lyra allowed herself to believe in that possibility. She turned back to the window, watching as the stars stretched out before her. She was free, at least for now. The thought was almost too much to grasp. As the journey continued, Jackson kept his distance, giving Lyra space to adjust. She appreciated it. She wasn't used to being around anyone who didn't expect something from her. She wasn't used to being treated with kindness and understanding. It was as if Jackson wasn't just offering her freedom. He was offering her something deeper. Respect. She couldn't remember the last time someone had treated her like that. Most of the time, she had been seen as an object, something to be used and discarded. But Jackson was different. He didn't see her as a broken thing. He saw her as a person. That thought stirred something inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Days passed, and the ship's journey took them deeper into space. Lyra started to feel more comfortable, although she still couldn't completely shake the feeling of being out of place. She spent her time exploring the ship, though it was mostly quiet. The crew members, when she met them, were kind but kept to themselves, just as Jackson had. One evening, as they were passing through a distant star system, Jackson found her alone in one of the ship's observation rooms. The stars outside were like scattered jewels, glittering against the backdrop of the vast, dark universe. "You don't have to be alone," Jackson said, stepping into the room. Lyra turned to him, surprised. "I'm not alone," she said, though her words didn't sound convincing even to herself. Jackson smiled. "I didn't mean physically. I meant you don't have to shut yourself off from everyone." For the first time, Lyra felt a pang of something unfamiliar, guilt. She hadn't meant to shut herself off. It was just that it had always been easier to keep her emotions hidden, to build walls around herself so that no one could hurt her. But with Jackson, she didn't need to do that. He wasn't like the others. "I don't know how to trust people," she admitted, looking down at her hands. Jackson didn't reply right away. He simply took a step closer, offering a NTL nod. "I understand. Trust isn't something that can be given lightly. But I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. Just take your time." Lyra nodded, her gaze drifting back to the stars. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt such a sense of peace. The life she had known, of fear and servitude, felt like a distant memory, one that she was slowly but surely leaving behind. As the days went on, Lyra's world slowly began to change. She no longer felt like she was just waiting for something to happen. She was beginning to realize that she had the power to choose what came next. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was a person with a future. And in that future, perhaps there was a place for her, for someone like Jackson, who had given her the greatest gift of all, the chance to live as her true self, free from the chains that had bound her for so long. The journey through space was peaceful, but Lyra couldn't shake the uncertainty in her heart. Each day felt like a new chapter in a life she had never imagined. The stars outside the ship were beautiful, but they also reminded her of the life she had left behind, a life of darkness and pain. She had been a slave for as long as she could remember, and the idea of freedom was still hard to accept. Jackson was always kind to her, always patient. He never pushed her to open up, but she could feel his quiet presence, his support in the background. She began to wonder if he truly saw her as a person, not just someone who had been rescued, but as someone with her own dreams, her own thoughts. For the first time in years, she started to believe that she might have a future, one that wasn't decided by someone else. One day, Jackson found her sitting alone in the ship's common room. The room was quiet, the hum of the engines a soft background sound. Lyra was staring out the window, lost in thought. "Are you okay?" Jackson asked gently, standing in the doorway. Lyra turned to him, startled by the question. She had never been asked that before. Not truly. The aliens who had owned her never cared how she felt, and the others who had been slaves with her were too consumed by their own pain to ask. "I'm fine," she said, her voice softer than she intended. But she knew it wasn't true. She wasn't fine. She was lost, unsure of where to go or what to do next. But admitting it felt like a weakness, something she wasn't sure she could show to anyone. Jackson didn't say anything at first, just stood there for a moment. Then, he walked over and sat down beside her. He didn't pressure her to speak, but his quiet presence made her feel a little less alone. "I know it's hard," he said finally. "I can't imagine what you've been through, but you don't have to keep it all inside. You can talk to me when you're ready." Lyra nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know if she was ready, but something inside her stirred. She wanted to speak, to tell him everything that had happened, to share the years of pain and fear that had shaped her. But those words were locked inside her, buried deep in a place she wasn't sure she wanted to visit. For now, she kept quiet, but she was grateful for the silence between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, like it had been with others. With Jackson, the silence felt safe, like he was giving her space to figure things out on her own. The next few days passed quietly. Lyra spent more time aboard the ship getting to know the small crew members who had become like family to Jackson. There was a woman named Zara, a former soldier who had left her planet in search of a new life. She was kind, but tough, and she often sat with Lyra, teaching her small things about the world beyond the slave markets. Zara told Lyra stories of places she had visited, of distant planets and cities with tall, shining buildings, and people who lived without fear. At first, Lyra found it hard to believe. She had spent so many years in a world where freedom was just a dream, and the idea of a life where she wasn't controlled seemed impossible. But Zara's words planted a seed of hope. Maybe there was more to the universe than she had ever known. Maybe she could be part of that world, too. The days turned into weeks, and slowly Lyra began to adjust. She started to speak more, to ask questions about the life she had never experienced. Jackson was always there, listening patiently, answering her questions with kindness and honesty. His presence became a constant, something she could rely on. One evening, as they were passing through a quiet star system, Lyra found herself sitting with Jackson on the observation deck. The stars outside were breathtaking, a sea of lights that stretched on forever. For the first time, Lyra felt a sense of peace wash over her. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't a slave anymore. "What's it like?" she asked, her voice soft. Jackson looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "What's it like to be free?" he asked, repeating her question. Lyra nodded. It was a question she had never really asked before, not in a way that meant anything. She had always known. That freedom was a distant dream, something too far out of reach to even think about. But now, as she sat here, looking out at the endless stars, the thought seemed possible. Jackson smiled gently. "It's like waking up from a nightmare and realizing you're finally awake," he said. "It's not easy, and it's not always perfect, but it's yours. You get to decide what comes next." Lyra thought about his words for a long moment. She had never been given the chance to decide anything for herself. Everything had always been controlled by someone else. Her captors, her masters, the aliens who had bought and sold her. "I don't know if I can," she admitted quietly, looking down at her hands. "I don't know how to live a life that's mine." Jackson placed a hand on her shoulder, a comforting gesture that felt warm against the coldness that had once filled her heart. "You don't have to know all at once. Just take it one step at a time. We're all figuring it out together." Lyra looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was something in his gaze, something kind, something real, that made her believe his words. Maybe she didn't have to figure it all out now. Maybe she could take her time, build a new life from the ground up, with people who cared. The bass. Stars outside seemed to shine a little brighter, as if they were welcoming her into a new world. A world where she could finally be free. The journey had been peaceful so far, but Lyra knew that peace wouldn't last forever. The universe was vast, and though she had found freedom, danger was always close, lurking in the darkness between the stars. Jackson had warned her about the risks they would face. The empire that had enslaved her. The empire that still controlled. Vast parts of the galaxy wouldn't forget the humiliation of a human buying one of their slaves. It was only a matter of time before they came after them. Lyra had heard stories of the Empire's wrath, how they hunted down those who defied them, making examples of anyone who dared to rebel. She had seen the fear in Jackson's eyes when he talked about the Empire. He wasn't afraid of them, but he knew the cost of standing against such power. It wasn't long before the warnings became a reality. One evening, as the ship drifted through the quiet depths of space, a sudden alert blared throughout the ship. The sound echoed in the hallways, sharp and urgent. Lyra jumped in surprise, her heart racing. She had never heard that sound before, and she knew instantly that something was wrong. Jackson appeared in the doorway, his face serious. "We've been detected. The Empire found us." Lyra's stomach twisted. She had known it would happen, but hearing those words out loud made it feel real. The Empire was coming, and there was no way to avoid them. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her, the uncertainty of what would come next. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She was someone the Empire would want to punish. Jackson quickly moved to the control panel, his fingers moving with purpose as he tried to outmaneuver the approaching fleet. "We're not going to make it easy for them," he muttered to himself, though his words were meant more for him than for Lyra. Lyra stood frozen for a moment, watching him. She had seen him in battle before, seen the strength in his eyes when he made decisions that could mean life or death for the people around him. But this was different. This time it wasn't just his life on the line. It was hers as well. "Will we be okay?" Lyra asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jackson glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I won't let them take you." Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, it was hard to breathe. He wasn't just protecting her out of obligation. He cared, and for the first time, Lyra realized how much that truly meant. He was fighting for her, for the life they had started to build together. She wasn't just a slave he had freed, she was someone worth fighting for. The ship shook suddenly, jolting Lyra out of her thoughts. The alarm blared louder, and she could feel the tension building in the air. She moved to Jackson's side, trying to understand what was happening. "Are we going to fight them?" she asked. Jackson nodded, his jaw tight. "We have no choice. But I'm not going to let them capture you. We'll get through this." Lyra took a deep breath. She had never been part of a fight before, never had the strength or will to stand up against those who held power. But she wasn't the same person she had been when they first met. She had learned from Jackson, from the way he carried himself, from the way he refused to back down. She wasn't helpless anymore. "I'll help," she said, her voice steady. It surprised her that the words came out so confidently. She didn't know what she could do to help, but she wasn't going to hide. She wasn't going to be the scared slave cowering in the corner anymore. Jackson looked at her, his expression softening. "You don't have to, but I'm glad you're with me." The ship lurched again, and the shaking grew stronger. Lyra could hear the sound of the enemy ships closing in, their engines roaring in the distance. Jackson's fingers moved quickly, pressing buttons on the control panel as he tried to outmaneuver the enemy. But it was clear they were closing in on them. "We're running out of time," Jackson said. "Get to the cargo hold. Take cover. I'll handle the rest." Lyra hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She didn't want to hide. She wanted to stand beside him, to fight for the life they had started to build. But she trusted him. She knew he would do everything in his power to keep them both safe. She ran to the cargo hold, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't see the battle, but she could feel it, the tension, the fear, the sense of urgency. It wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for the future, for freedom, for everything they had worked for. As she crouched in the cargo hold, Lyra closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing. She thought of the life she had left behind, the life of a slave, the life of constant fear. She had thought that would be her reality forever. But now, she was here, with Jackson, with people who cared for her, with a future that was hers to shape. The sound of blaster fire echoed through the ship, and Lyra's heart jumped. She knew Jackson was fighting, doing everything he could to protect them. And for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. She felt strong. She wasn't just the broken girl from the auction anymore. She was more than that. Jackson's voice crackled through the comm system, steady and confident. "We're not giving up. Stay strong, Lyra. I'll get us through this." Her heart swelled with determination. She wasn't alone. She would never be alone again. The battle raged on outside, but inside the ship, Lyra held on to the belief that they would survive. They had already come so far, and now they had everything to fight for. Their future was in their hands, and they weren't going to let anyone take it away. The battle outside the ship had been fierce, but it seemed to have slowed down. The Empire's forces, though powerful, were not able to break through Jackson's defense systems as easily as they had hoped. The ship had sustained some damage, but it was still functional. Jackson had managed to outmaneuver their attacks, buying them the time they needed to escape. Lyra sat quietly in the cargo hold, her hands clasped tightly together. The battle had ended for now, but the fear still lingered in her heart. She knew that the Empire would not give up so easily. They would keep coming, and the fight wasn't over. But in that moment, as the ship sailed deeper into uncharted space, she allowed herself to breathe. They had survived. She had survived. It was more than she could have hoped for just a few weeks ago. Jackson entered the cargo hold, his face grim but relieved. He wiped his forehead, looking tired, but there was a spark in his eyes that told Lyra he was just as determined as ever. "We made it through," he said, his voice steady. "We're not out of danger yet, but we've bought ourselves some time." Lyra stood up, her legs feeling a bit weak after so much tension. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, her voice trembling slightly despite her best efforts to stay calm. Jackson smiled, a faint, encouraging smile. "Now, we keep moving forward. We'll make repairs, lay low, and figure out our next move. We're not running anymore. We're fighting for a future." Lyra nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of fear and hope. She had never imagined that she would be a part of something like this, that she would be fighting for something more than just survival. But here she was, standing beside Jackson and the rest of the crew, facing the unknown together. Over the next few days, Lyra helped with the repairs, doing whatever she could to make herself useful. She wasn't sure where she fit in yet, but she was determined to contribute. The crew accepted her without question, each one treating her with kindness and respect. It was a strange feeling, being treated as an equal rather than as an object, as someone with something to offer rather than someone who was only worth what she could give. Jackson worked tirelessly, checking the ship's systems, monitoring the sensors for any sign of the Empire's pursuit. Lyra could see the weight on his shoulders, the responsibility he carried not just for the ship and its crew, but for her as well. She wanted to tell him that she could handle things, that he didn't have to worry so much about her, but she knew it wasn't that simple. Jackson cared, and she couldn't deny the way that made her feel. For the first time in her life, someone cared about her well-being, and it made her realize how much she had taken that for granted. One afternoon, as they were working in the ship's control room, Lyra found herself sitting next to Jackson. She watched as he adjusted the controls, his hands moving confidently, every action deliberate. She could see the concentration in his face, but there was also something else, a quiet strength that gave her hope. "Jackson," she said, her voice low. He looked up, his brow furrowing slightly. "What is it?" Lyra hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to put her thoughts into words. I'm not used to this. To being free, to being part of something. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Jackson leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. You're doing exactly what you need to do. You're here. You're part of this crew, part of this fight. You don't have to have all the answers. We'll figure it out together. For a moment, Lyra just looked at him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine care he had for her. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to her. She wasn't just a passenger on this journey. She was an active part of it. She was a fighter now, even if she hadn't fully realized it yet. The days passed by, and with each one, Lyra felt herself growing stronger. She spent more time with the crew, learning from them, asking questions about the galaxy beyond the Empire's reach. She learned about different planets, different races, and how they all coexisted in a delicate balance of peace and conflict. There was so much she had never known, so much she had been kept from seeing. It was overwhelming, but also exciting. As time went on, Lyra began to understand what Jackson had meant. They weren't just surviving anymore, they were building something. Together they were creating a future where freedom wasn't just a dream, it was a reality. They were fighting to take back control of their lives, to rebuild the world that had been destroyed by tyranny and oppression. One evening, as they sat in the common room, the stars shining brightly outside, Lyra turned to Jackson. She had been thinking about his words, about everything they had gone through so far, and she realized that she had changed. She wasn't the broken, fearful girl who had been sold at an auction. She was stronger now. She had a purpose. I'm not afraid anymore, she said quietly. Jackson looked at her, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. That's good to hear. Lyra smiled back, feeling the weight that had been on her shoulders for so long start to lift. She wasn't alone. She had a place in this world. She had a future, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it away from her. Together, they would face whatever came next, and they would do it as a team. For the first time in her life, Lyra truly believed that anything was possible. Days turned into weeks, and the ship continued to sail through the vast emptiness of space. Jackson and his crew had managed to evade the Empire's forces, but they knew it was only a matter of time before they were found again. The galaxy was large, but it was not infinite, and the Empire's reach was far and wide. Still, Jackson remained, determined, focusing on the next steps rather than dwelling on the dangers that loomed over them. Lyra had learned much in her time aboard the ship. She was no longer the quiet, fearful girl who had first stepped onto Jackson's vessel. She had become a part of the crew, working alongside them to ensure their survival. Her confidence had grown, and she no longer hesitated when faced with challenges. The life she had once known, one of chains and silence, was becoming a distant memory, replaced by something much stronger, a sense of purpose. One evening, as the crew gathered in the common room, a sense of tension filled the air. The crew members were discussing their next move, the plans to evade the Empire's forces once again. Lyra listened closely, her mind focused on the possibilities that lay ahead. Jackson stood at the front of the room, his face serious as he outlined their strategy. We've been laying low for weeks now, but we can't keep running forever. We need to find a place where we can truly be free. A place where the Empire can't find us. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She had never imagined that she would be looking for a home, a place where she could truly belong. It was a foreign concept to her, one she hadn't allowed herself to dream of for fear that it would never come true. We'll need to gather more information, Jackson continued. We need to find a place where we can stay hidden, a place with enough resources to keep us safe and help us rebuild. Lyra looked around at the crew, noticing how each person seemed to carry a piece of the same hope. They were all in this together, working toward the same goal. She realized that this wasn't just about escaping the Empire, it was about creating something better, something lasting. It was about building a future. She raised her hand, a rare but confident move. "I can help," she said, her voice steady. "I know how the Empire works. I've seen it from the inside. I know how they track people, how they move their ships. I can be useful." Jackson looked at her with a soft smile, his eyes filled with appreciation. "I knew you'd say that. We'll need all the help we can get." Lyra felt a sense of pride wash over her. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was part of a team. And her skills, once dismissed by others, were now seen as valuable. For the first time, she felt like she had something to offer, something important. As the next few days passed, Lyra worked closely with the crew to gather intelligence. She spent hours reviewing the ship's systems, learning how to use the tools. They had to track enemy movements and monitor the Empire's fleet. She was no expert, but with each passing day, she grew more confident in her ability to help. Jackson never asked her to do anything she wasn't comfortable with, and he always made sure she knew her contributions were important. The more she worked, the more she realized how much she had changed. She had gone from being a passive observer to an active participant, someone who could shape the future alongside Jackson and the crew. One night, as they sat in the common room, Lyra found herself talking to Zara, the former soldier who had become one of her closest friends. Zara had always been a strong and confident woman, and Lyra had admired her from the beginning. "I used to be scared of everything," Lyra said quietly, her voice reflecting the vulnerability she hadn't shown in a long time. "I thought I would never be free, that I would always be stuck in that life. But now, I don't know. It's like I'm learning to live again." Zara smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "It's not easy, but you're stronger than you think. We all are. It's not about where we've been, but where we're going." Lyra nodded, taking in Zara's words. She had come so far in such a short time. She had learned that her past didn't define her, that she could make choices for herself, that she could shape her future. The next morning, the crew made a decision. They would head toward an uncharted planet on the outer edges of the galaxy, a place rumored to be outside the Empire's reach. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance at finding safety. As they traveled toward the unknown, Lyra's heart swelled with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't know what would happen when they reached the planet, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer alone. She was no longer a slave. She had a family now, a group of people who cared for her and who would fight for her. Together, they would face whatever came next. Jackson stood at the helm of the ship, his eyes focused on the stars ahead. "This is it," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "We're not running anymore. We're taking control of our future." Lyra stood beside him, feeling the weight of his words settle into her heart. She had never thought of herself as someone who could change the world. But now, standing at the edge of the galaxy, she realized that she had the power to create a new life, a life filled with hope, with purpose, and with the promise of a future that was hers to build. The days passed as they made their way to the uncharted planet. Lyra watched from the window of the ship as the stars slowly changed, the familiar constellations shifting into strange new formations. There was a quiet anticipation in the air, a sense that they were on the verge of something important. This planet, unknown to the Empire, might be their chance at freedom. But the uncertainty still hung over them. No one could be sure what awaited them on the other side of the galaxy. Lyra spent much of her time in the control room, helping Jackson with the ship's systems. She was learning faster than she had ever thought possible. The skills she had developed on the ship, things she never knew she was capable of, gave her a growing sense of confidence. But it wasn't just about the technical skills. It was about who she had become. The fear that had once paralyzed her was slowly fading, replaced by determination and a quiet strength. As they neared the planet, the crew began preparing for landing. Lyra could feel the excitement building, but there was also a weight on her heart. She knew that even if they found a safe place to hide, the Empire would never forget their defiance. They had made enemies, powerful enemies. The fight wouldn't be over just because they found a new home. Jackson stood at the front of the control room, his eyes scanning the monitors. "We'll land soon. Stay alert," he said. His voice was calm, but Lyra could hear the edge of concern beneath it. They had made it this far, but the real test was just beginning. The ship descended through the atmosphere of the planet, the blue sky above them slowly giving way to the green and brown landscape below. The planet was beautiful. Wild forests and sweeping valleys stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was fresh, clean, and unlike anything Lyra had ever experienced. She had spent so many years on cold, sterile ships, in dark cells, in the oppressive heat of the slave markets. This was different. This was life. The ship touched down gently on the surface, the sound of the engines slowly dying down as the landing. Gear settled into place. Lyra felt a strange thrill run through her. This was it. They had arrived. Jackson turned to her, offering a smile that was filled with both pride and uncertainty. "We've made it. Let's see what we can find here." Foss. Crew quickly began unloading supplies, checking the ship for any damage from the journey. Lyra joined them, carrying what she could, doing whatever she could to help. It felt good to be needed, to have a purpose. But as the day wore on and the sun began to set, she couldn't shake the feeling of something looming just beyond the horizon. The world around them was beautiful, but it wasn't free from danger. As night fell, they set up camp near the ship. The stars overhead were clearer than Lyra had ever seen before, and for the first time, she allowed herself to truly relax. The sound of the wind in the trees was soothing, and the quiet hum of the ship was a reminder that they had made it this far. They had a chance to breathe, to recover. The crew sat around a small fire, sharing stories, laughter filling the air. It was a stark contrast to the life Lyra had known. Back in the slave markets, there had been no warmth, no laughter, no freedom. The only sounds had been the cold, distant voices of buyers and sellers, the noise of chains. But now, as she sat with Jackson and the others, she realized that she had found something she never thought possible: a family. Jackson leaned back, gazing at the fire. His face, usually so serious, seemed lighter now. The weight of their journey temporarily lifted. "We've made it this far," he said, his voice soft. "But this is just the beginning. We'll build something here, something better." Lyra looked around at the crew, their faces lit by the firelight. She could see the determination in their eyes. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a team, working together to build a future, and she was a part of it. The thought filled her with a warmth she hadn't known in years. She wasn't just a slave anymore. She wasn't someone to be bought and sold. She was someone with a voice, with the power to choose her own path. "We'll make it," Lyra said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. But as she looked around the camp, she knew she wasn't just speaking to herself anymore. She was speaking to all of them. Together, they would make it. As the night stretched on, they spoke of their hopes for the future, of how they would build a new life on this planet, how they would help others who were still trapped in the Empire's grip. The Empire may have been powerful, but it was no match for the strength of those who refused to stay silent, who refused to be broken. Jackson stood up, offering his hand to Lyra. "Come on, let's take a walk. There's something I want to show you." Lyra took his hand, feeling the warmth of his touch, the trust between them growing with every passing moment. Together they walked away from the camp, the firelight slowly fading behind them. They walked in silence, the cool night air brushing against their skin. As they reached the top of a small hill, Jackson stopped and gestured toward the horizon. "Look at this," he said, his voice filled with awe. Lyra looked out over the valley below them. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a silver glow over the landscape. The land stretched out before them, untouched and wild, full of possibilities. This was the future they would build, one where they would no longer live in fear, one where they could be free. Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with hope. They had come so far, and though the road ahead was uncertain, they were ready. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way. They had already defeated the greatest enemy of all, the fear that had kept them trapped.